Good morning, good morning. I realize we had a lot of folks in church, but I think a lot of folks are headed to brunch or family gatherings, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. Happy Mother's Day to all of you who are mothers, or do have mothers in your memory, or have been mothered. I think that ought to catch everyone. We had the perfect class today because we're going to be slamming men all day long, and women are going to get off scot-free. Actually, I do want to kind of offer a caveat at the opening that all of what we're going to talk about today is gendered because the Bible is gendered, and I'm not going to attempt to solve that problem for you. So take it for what it's trying to offer, and we can talk at another time about how you might update some of that for our current social circumstances. But for now, I think there's enough to get a sense of things. All right. It's time to move to Noah and the flood. Given our time this morning, I'm not going to talk about the story of the flood, really. It's interesting. There are other Mesopotamian myths that it correlates with, and that's worth another class. Instead, I'm going to talk about why God felt the need to flood the earth. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I think it picks up and amplifies and clarifies the themes that we've been talking about in the creation stories. You will remember that I've claimed, as Koss does, that Genesis is a comprehensive narrative, which is to say as much stuff as there was in those first creation stories, the themes that we're going to develop throughout the rest of our time together were all there. So hopefully what we talk about today will help you understand at greater depth what we talked about in the previous classes. But to ensure that happens, of course, we will pray. So I invite you to join me in our opening prayer. Let us pray. God, by whom the meek are guided in judgment, and light rises up in darkness for the godly, grant us in all our doubts and uncertainties the grace to ask what you would have us do, that the Spirit of wisdom may save us from all false choices, and that in your light we may see light, and in your straight path we may not stumble. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. As I mentioned, Genesis is a coherent narrative, and it also sets forth what we might think of as a new way of being. The new way of being, inaugurated by the election of Abraham, which we hadn't gotten to yet, is really twofold. It's about righteousness, our relationship with each other, and holiness, our relationship with God. We're going to read Genesis in a way that Cass describes as philosophically. That is, we're not going to read it in the context of where it came from or who wrote it or why it's there or when it was added or when it was ultimately written down or where it was distributed, except to the extent that it helps us determine how to live a good life. Our purpose, therefore, is to determine how to live. That is why Genesis was written, I think. That's been abandoned by the academy, and that's fine. But in the church, we're going to hold on to the original purpose of the literature. What can we see in these stories about the patterns of God's involvement with creation that we can still detect today? And hopefully, as we go through this discussion, that will become apparent to you. There are patterns in the way God interacts with creation that are detectable today. So that our real purpose for all the stuff we talk about is to become more aware of God's presence in our own lives now. Does that make sense? Our goal is to become more aware of God's presence in our lives now. Our belief is that God is always there. The Spirit is always present. We don't call God forth. We don't make God appear. We simply try to open ourselves to recognize the presence that is already there. We try to open ourselves that that presence may enter and exist and flow through us. But it is already there. God would never leave us. That is our fundamental faith. All right, So what have we learned so far? In the first creation story, we learned that human beings are not yet good. That is to say, there's work to be done. We are created in the image of God, and the expectation is we will continue to grow. We are not already fixed as perfect and need to do nothing else. In the second creation story, we got a sense of what that growth might look like. As in eating the fruit of the tree, Adam, humankind, and Eve, who was formed to be his helper, learned how to distinguish differences, how to tell one thing from another. And in doing so, they learned how to distinguish that they are different from other things. And they learned in that moment how to be ashamed and afraid and worried, i.e., to join life with the rest of us, how to be self-conscious. And in that self-consciousness, you might say that they are made in the image of God in order to grow into the likeness of God. Made in the image of God in order to grow into the likeness of God. That's the way the early Eastern patristic fathers framed the Christian life. And that's what I think you're going to see in today's story about the flood, at least why it came. We moved then to Cain and Abel. And this idea that one of the desires of man is to jump the gap between man and God. We naturally want to be God or God-like, and it doesn't always work out very well. In this case, and this is my language, not Cass's, I think there's an assumption. So it's not that you're thinking this, I just think it describes what happens. There's an assumption that all the being that's possible, all the life that we can get is already distributed and everybody's got their share, right? You got your allocation of being. So the only way for you to grow in being is to take some from somebody else. You with me? It's like everybody's got their bowl of porridge, and if you're still hungry or want more, you have to take some from somebody else. As opposed to what we as Christians believe, which is there's an unlimited amount of being. That's the graciousness and loving generosity of God. God is constantly giving us more and more being. Our challenge is simply to open ourselves and expand our capacity to accept it. A very different assumption from the idea that if I want more being, if I want to be more alive, I've got to take it from somebody else. I think that's what's going on in Cain and Abel, and I hope you'll be able to see that pattern as it expresses itself through rivalry, for example, through competition, through violence. You'll be able to see that pattern in our lives today. You really only have to turn on your computer and you're going to see evidence of it, right? All right, that's what we've learned so far. So why, after that, does God decide that he's done? Why does God decide that somehow humanity has become so wicked that he just wants to start again? As if starting again would be a good idea, but we'll pin that question. Why does God decide that? That's what we're going to talk about today. So you might say there's a worm in the family tree. There's actually a third creation story. I know you thought you were done, but there's a third creation story. That third creation story occurs in Genesis 5. It's called the Book of Generations of Man, and it describes a new line. I'll call it the line of Seth. In the second creation story, you'll remember at the end that after they leave the garden, Adam and Eve conceive, and Eve bears their first son, whose name is Cain. In the third creation story, they conceive a son whose name is Seth. Now, if you compare the two genealogies, there are a lot of similarities, and you're welcome. We're not going to do that. Those genealogies are baffling enough with all the begats. I'm not going to drag you through it for fear you would never come back. But I do want you to know it's there. And throughout that chapter 5, there's a line, I'll call it the line of Seth, which then can be contrasted with the line of Cain, which appears at the end of the 4th chapter of Genesis. So two different lines. And the line, and they have different characteristics. We have to extrapolate a little bit, but they have different characteristics. So the line of Cain, you might think of as a line of heroes. They're a line of men who are doing mighty acts, which tend to be more and more violent. We finally get to Lamech. Remember at the bottom where he's boasting of how viciously he takes the life of others. Remember the kind of 70 times 7 claim that I was contrasting with Jesus' answer to Peter about forgiveness? That's Lamech at the end of the line of Cain, boasting of violence because it is evidence of his power, of his ability to dominate others, which he thinks is good, right? It's a sign of life. That's not true in the line of Seth. You don't have inventors. You don't have warriors. You don't seemingly have anybody that did anything special, except it says they walked closer to God. Somehow the line of Seth is described as being closer to God than the line of Cain. Less heroic accomplishments, more saintly characteristics is how I would describe it. So we get these two lines that I think are there to give us a sense of two different ways of living life, or if you will, two different things to admire. Do we admire the heroes or do we admire the saints? Well, we're going to explore that a bit. So I'm going to start with the first 5 verses of Genesis, and you know what I want. I'd love for someone to read this. You can ignore the bracketed Hebrew. Just read the English. If you'll raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you.
You're gonna call on me? Okay, since I've been called upon. This is the book of the generations of man. In the day that God created man, in the likeness of God, he made him. Male and female created he them, and blessed them and called their name man in the day they were created. And man lived 130 years and begot a son in his own likeness, after his image, and called his name Seth. And the days of man after he begot Seth were 800 years, and he begot sons and daughters. And all the days of man, Adam, were 930 years, and he died.
Perfect. Well read with no preparation. I appreciate that. So I have kind of made a big point about Adam being Hebrew for humankind, or as I described, for not a rock. But it's confusing when you read through Genesis because sometimes it's clear that Adam is intended to reference all of mankind. And there's an argument that Adam, prior to the creation of Eve, was androgynous, right? Was not male necessarily, but either sexless or androgynous. Remember, it was only after that Eve was created that Adam, in seeing her, named himself and began to display the first masculine characteristics. So, what's confusing is sometimes Adam stands for all of humankind. And sometimes Adam seems to stand for just that individual before the creation of Eve. So just know there's that ambiguity running through it. And we don't even use it consistently in a single paragraph. Sometimes it's a person, sometimes it's humanity. My take on that would be, for the writers of Genesis, that was perfectly understandable. This was simply an instance of a thing. You with me? An instance of a thing. Unique perhaps, but common to all other similarly configured instances. All right. So what do we notice about this? Male and female, he created humanity. He blessed them, called their name Adam. So you see the collective reference there. In the day they were created. Man lived 130 years and begot a son in his own image. So we're pulling the same kind of imagery that we used in the first creation story. And in his own, begot his own likeness, which is imagery from the second creation story. It's all mixed in here. And called his name Seth, which is a little bit new because Seth doesn't come till much later in the line of Cain. And the days of man after he begot Seth were 800 years. So that first prediction of dying upon eating the fruit of the tree, Perhaps not immediately, right? Remember, God says you will die if you eat thereof, and the serpent says, no, you're not going to die. Well, they did die, but it took a while. It took a while. All the days of man were 930 years. All right, the prophecy is finally fulfilled, as we said. But this is kind of interesting. If you calculate, so we're starting at 0 and running from there. So forget our calendar years. Adam dies in 930. That's a long life, 930 years. I don't want to live 930 years. My back isn't going to make it 930 years. So 930, Enoch is 987 years, and Seth, 1042. 1042. Which means, of course, that, when Adam dies in 930, you've got almost a century where nobody has known death. So God says in the prediction, if you eat the fruit of the tree, you will surely die. And yet, at least in the third creation story, nobody seems to for a long time. What difference does that make? Well, Noah, the protagonist in our flood story, is the first person in that genealogy who doesn't know death, who does know death, right? Up until that point, up until the death of Adam, 930 years, nobody has died. So Cass's theory is that this is powerful because although we've talked about self-consciousness and death and the denial or fear of death as being this fundamental motivator in who we are and what we do and how we live, the truth is it takes a while for that to work itself in to humanity. So that Noah, Cass says, not Adam, is really the prototype for the self-consciously mortal man, the first human who truly lived knowing they were going to die. With me? So different story, right? This is the third creation story where it's not Cain but Seth who is the line. But that's going to be important. So, but the theme that I promised you would be carried forward is a theme of death and our awareness of death and how critical that is to our sense of ourselves and our own need to survive. So what do we do if we think we are going to die? In the face of death, Kath reminds us, men attempt to defeat death by becoming heroes. So here we are. He's tying this temptation to become heroic, not always, obviously. We're thankful for heroic acts. But the way they're using the term hero, it's an attempt to be immortal. It's an attempt to do something that gathers acclaim and status that lives on past you, right? And it's not just by violently suppressing your neighbors. It is also by creating beautiful things. One motivation for being an artist is to create something that lives on. And of course, we think about that with our children too, so it's not that it's always bad. I just want you to see it, as Cass describes it, something that we utilize to try to defeat death. So statues and paintings, poems and song, vases and temples, we hope that they're last immune to decay. The great example of this, which Cass doesn't talk about, but the great example of this, I think, in our kind of consciousness is the early 19th century poem by Shelley. It's a sonnet, actually. I don't know how to pronounce this, Ozymandias. Anyway, in this poem, what is written on the statue this conqueror in Egypt plants in the midst of what was then a civilization, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. i.e., I'm Lord of all of you. Of course, when they found this statue, it was broken in pieces, lying in the desert, and there was nothing to be seen, which I think makes it funny in a kind of literary, ironic way. Can you get Lyons a microphone, please? But Percy wrote this poem in once they had found the statue, of which I've given you an image, and put it in the British Museum. It's just a fragment of that statue. Ramses II from the 13th century. And I note here, I said it was Mother's Day, that Koss notes that women can answer this awareness of mortality by giving birth. that there's a generative function that women perform that serves the purpose, and they're not as likely, he actually says they don't, to pursue this heroic image which defeats death. Yes.
You mentioned the being before man and woman was androgynous. Is that what you said?
In the second creation story, yes.
And androgyny is?
Both.
Both.
Yeah.
Okay, so my question is, first of all, my mind is blown by all this stuff, but anyway, does that suggest evolution?
Does the movement from androgyny to gender suggest evolution? I don't know, but clearly the story suggests evolution because things are growing and changing, yes. And that change is contemplated, right?
2001, it's sort of 2001 where there's consciousness, their brain, or all these things are developing.
Well, right. So that gets back to Teilhard. Yes. So remember when we talked about Teilhard de Chardin, what Desjardins, just keep the mic until you know you're done. Desjardins, which is good because these are good questions, but Desjardins is saying that evolution is really driven by the agency of love. Not this meme, this Richard Dawkins-like meme that knows nothing but survival, but the agency of love, which is constantly drawing things together and combining them into larger and more complex structures. And that consciousness is key to all of that. So we are growing over time in our awareness, which is why, for example, it's so dangerous to look back on prior civilizations or practices and condemn them as morally inferior or wrong. It's not that they're not, but we're operating with a level of consciousness now that they did not have, we hope. So when people say, are things getting better? Well, maybe they are, maybe they're not. I don't know what your criteria might be for that. But I believe that it's clear that our consciousness is expanding. That as it did in the second creation story, that carries its problems and it carries its benefits. But we are more aware of each other. We are more aware of pain and suffering. We are more empathetic to it, I think, than we've ever been. Right? Which I would argue is an expansion of consciousness. We're more worried about things that are happening in other places than we would have been 300 years ago, which I believe is an expansion of consciousness. We're more aware of humanity in its different forms, still bearing the symbol of God than we were 100 years ago, right? Which is why we're having all these battles about what the norm ought to look like. Does it have to be heterosexual? Does it have to be patriarchal? Is there an ethnic component to it? All these questions, which I encompass in the idea of drawing the circle wider, I believe are a function of expansion of consciousness. Asking questions seriously that weren't being asked by the dominant rulers 100, 200, 300 years ago. Can you have, no, please wait for the mic, I'm sorry.
Oh.
But there you go.
And could you also argue that we are trying to create consciousness with AI?
Well, I mean, have we? I think not yet. Are we trying to? Probably. I don't know. It seems natural almost, right? I mean, all of AI, which I'm kind of a fan of, just to declare myself, I feel like I've got a new research assistant, right? Which is upsetting to my wife who says, "You're never going to ask me anything anymore, are you?" Well, I mean, I don't know. But it's clear to me, I use AI every day, right, for whatever I'm doing. And it's clear to me that AI is great, at least the ChatGPT-4 that I use is great in gathering information, structuring information, comparing and contrasting, which is different from thinking. So it can't make moral value judgments among the stuff. It can't tell me what you're interested in. It doesn't feel in that sense. Will it? Or will it be able to emulate that? There used to be this thing called the Turing test. Do you guys know about Alan Turing and the Turing test? I.e., the difference between machine learning and a human, you can tell if you talk to them. Well, that's clearly no longer always true. Does that mean it's conscious? I think it's helping us redefine what consciousness means. But I think the whole thing is, you could see the whole thing is a second creation story starting all over again. If you wanted to. I don't know. I think it's going to be interesting. I think we'll make it through my lifetime. It's up to the kids after that. All right. Well, you see my point here that Cass is looking at the line of Cain and this idea of heroism being driven by a motivation to defeat death. And that being resonant in the line of Cain, not in the line of Seth. Yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Everyone. So, 2 questions and a comment. So, years ago, I read a sci-fi novel. It takes place in the future, and there were 2 types of humans, Edenists and Atomists. The Edenists had found a gene that allowed them to transfer their consciousness, all their experiences and thoughts at the moment of death into their environment. And the theory is that they had less neuroses because they weren't worried about death anymore because they knew they'd live on. So that's a comment. But your question about how we are becoming more conscious, do you think that, I believe in evolution. I know there are some Christians that don't, but do you think the theory of evolution impacted, at least in the West, idea of how should I put this? So, like, before, people just kind of had this idea that they were just good people, bad people, sin, no sin. But evolution kind of made people think that maybe there's a biological component, environmental component to a lot of the things that we experience. Just thought I would bring that up and see what you thought.
Yeah, well, a couple of things. One, I think sci-fi is a great genre because it takes a look at who we are, free of some boundaries, and you get a very expansive kind of take on who we might really be. Secondly, there may be someone in here who knows better than I, but I don't think there actually is a theory of evolution that everybody subscribes to. You know, there's Darwin and what Darwin said. That's not really what scientists believe now. There's evolution as put forth by the new atheists. That's really not what scientists believe now. Maybe it's individual survival, maybe it's groups. I think there's an idea that we're changing and growing, and I certainly believe that. Whether that's encapsulated in a theory that explains it all, I don't think that exists. I'm looking around for someone smarter than me. But what I've read suggests that when people talk about evolution, there's not a lot of agreement on what you're actually talking about. Now, there are some biblical fundamentalists who believe that, evolution isn't a thing, and Adam and Eve are created, and that's that. And I don't know, that never made any sense to me. Somewhere in the Midwest, there's a big ark that's been constructed. Anybody know about this? What's it called? Something, and it's got this massive ark apparently, and then as you're standing in line to get into this ark, there's a video that tells you all that they did to create the ark, and in order to follow the biblical instructions. And of course, it took them a year. They moved I don't know how many tons of earth with massive modern earth movers. They constructed all kinds of things that didn't priorly exist. It took massive workers, millions of dollars that they raised. The donors' names are right there. All of which would suggest perhaps that Noah and his boys didn't do that. Right? So in the very effort to claim that that is how it was all done, I think you've refuted that. Similarly, the idea that the basic outline was set at the beginning of creation, which was only hundreds of thousands of years ago and not longer, to me just kind of doesn't hold up, and I don't pay much attention to it. I will say that I grew up in my teenage years in a little town in South Carolina, and in the 6th grade, maybe 7th grade, I can't remember, my best friend, excuse me, and I were in a debate tournament, a debate at school, and we took the side, because it was important to him, I didn't really care, we took the side that evolution wasn't real. And we won, which in Sumter, South Carolina at that time wasn't that hard. But, but we won the debate, and I was like, and my father, the Episcopal priest, was horrified. So he's like, son, why did you do that? And I said, because we wanted to win. Well, we promptly made a family trip to Washington, D.C. and the Smithsonian, where my father laboriously led me through all of the scientific evidence for the creation and evolution of the world. Hilarious. It's, Dad, I didn't believe it. I just wanted to win, but whatever. So there you go. That's what I think. All right, we move to chapter 6, which is the crux of what's going on. And just to speed us along, I'm going to read it myself. And it came to pass that when men, you'll see from the Hebrew, we're still talking about Adam, began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, and saw that they were fair, that is to say, good, and they took them wives, whomsoever they chose. So you see what's happening here. You've got an expansion of the population, you've got these two lines, and they're starting to mix, right? Sons of God, daughters of men. Sons of God will be the line of God. That's who? Seth. Daughters of men would be the line of Cain. So you've got an intermixing of these tribes. So Cass is claiming. And there's question about which tribe is which, and I like sparing you from the genealogy. I'm going to spare you from this debate too. It's a very intense analysis about all the terminology used. I like the position Cass takes, which is the son of God are Seth, because they're closer to God, even though they come up in the genealogy of men, which occurs in the 5th chapter. Yes, Bill.
I was surprised I'm glad that you said what you just said in clarifying it, because this passage has always made me, or at least made my daughter, quite uncomfortable. Because it makes it seem like the men are closer to God than the women. It can be interpreted that way, and so I'm glad that you clarified that.
Yeah, I think that's not, yes. Well, let me clarify it further, because I think what you're talking about is men grabbing women, depending on whether they think they're fair, and taking them. So I think it's about domination, male domination, not about status. Yes. Wait till you get the microphone there.
I mean, just to simplify, doesn't this suggest that the men were writing the story and that they were positioning themselves close to God while the women were not writing the story? I mean, history's really told by those who want to tell their story best.
You mean, does this suggest that the man writing the story didn't listen to his wife when she...
Well, there's that too.
I'm just curious what you meant. Yeah, well, yes, it's clearly men writing the story. So as I said at the outset of class, all this is terribly gendered, and I'm not going to try to pull that out because I think there are human characteristics that we can identify with. So for me, I'm kind of, it's easier for me to make sense of all this, to think about a feminine principle and a male principle that are actually present in both men and women, but in different proportions. It's kind of a Jungian take on it all. It's also kind of a cop-out, but you can push back on that later. But there are a lot of ways to understand it, but yes, it's written by the men. Remember here, though, whoever the male writer is praising one group of men and condemning the other group of men, right? So they're still trying to draw out something there. Okay, well, I realize it looks like I just pulled this line of Cain and line of Seth out of nowhere, but there's a lot of scholarly support for that. I just don't want to take it out. So Cass thinks that the sons of men are the line of Cain, which pursues self-sufficiency and invented the arts of adornment, how to make ourselves look pretty. Clothes and jewelry and makeup and all those other things that men and women wear to improve their looks and appearances are products of the line of Cain, so the Bible says. Not the line of Seth, who didn't seem interested in any of those things. So the sons of God are the line of Seth, which simply are drawing closer to God. So there, you might say, more simple, more humble, walking closer to God. After the death of Adam and Seth, the more impious sons, that is, their line, were seduced by the adorned beauty of the other line. They looked after their leaders died, they looked around and they say, they're doing it right over there, and our simplicity is weakness and we don't like it, so we're going to go and take wives from the other line, i.e., take that blood and mix it with our own. Do you see that? This is not the only interpretation, but this is one Cass goes with. I don't think it matters who's mixing with who. The point is they mixed. And the bottom line is here, we're talking about male desire. We're talking about male desire, really. Male desire that leads to jealousy, competition, and violence. So this isn't the only place we talk about this issue. You might think about Helen and the Trojan War. Same principle there, right? This desire for this beautiful woman which sparks this prolonged war. All right. So in order to kind of sum this up, Cass says, I think brilliantly, whether from rage over mortality, that is, I'm angry that I'm going to die, from jealousy or resentment, I did get the woman, I didn't, or from a desire to gain favor from beautiful women, or to avenge the stealing of their wives and daughters. So you see, he's just saying whatever frame you want to take when you look at this conflict that's emerged between these two tribes, proud men, proud is not a good thing here, proud men are moved to the love of glory, one in bloody battle with one another. Happy Mother's Day. The world erupts into violence, the war into each against all. What ensues is what Thomas Hobbes would later call the state of nature. Remember Thomas Hobbes? State of nature, that is the state characterized by absence of clear juridical power, that is no external rules. We're all just supposed to figure out from our hearts what to do. In which the life of man is nasty, brutish, and short. Nasty, brutish, and through violence, short. Most people at some point in their education have come across Hobbes and the notion of nasty, brutish, and short. Cass is simply tying this back to this heroic effort by the line of Cain to defeat death. His conclusion, bloody destruction covers the earth. Now, I want to say here that you don't have to buy all of this, but it is meaningful, I think, to see that at the core, what's happening is people, through their own efforts, trying to sustain their lives. People, through their own efforts, trying to sustain their lives by becoming God. People, through their own efforts, trying to sustain their lives by becoming God. That is the core of what Cass is saying. So he interprets all of this to indicate that, but whether you buy all that or not, there's really a very simple principle at its core. So then we keep moving through chapter 6. The Lord says, my spirit shall not judge from within man forever, for he is also flesh. Therefore shall his days be 120 years. In other words, I'm done with these people. They clearly cannot be trusted, so I'm going to cut off this 900-year lifespan. I'm going to limit to 120. It's kind of like term limits, right? I'm done with Congress. If I only give them one term, maybe they won't do so much trouble. I, by the way, am against term limits. I'm afraid if they only thought they had one term, they'd do more trouble. But that's a different thing. So God's first effort to remedy this bloody, nasty return to chaos is, I'm going to shorten the lives of men. Then we go on to the next verse, the Nephilim. So some people believe that are giants, but I think the better interpretation is they're ones who've been slain, or maybe the slayers, but they're victims and or combatants in this battle. Were on the earth in those days and also afterwards when the sons of God, that is the line of Seth, were coming in to the daughters of man, that is the line of Cain, and they were bearing children to them. They are the heroes that from yore, which just means always, are the men of name. In other words, everybody now is trying to be a hero. Everybody's trying to be a hero. I don't want you to think about the Marine who threw himself on the grenade to save his peers. I want you to think about the individual who thinks by conquering others and dominating the world around them, they are more alive and will live longer than if they didn't. So to make that point, I'm going to go to my favorite androgynous, no, I'm just kidding. What is a hero? What is a hero? So Sam Wells, who is currently the vicar of a church in London, but was formerly and infamously the dean of the chapel at Durham University, that is to say Duke. He's a brilliant guy and I love him. He contrasts a hero and a saint in ways that I think are helpful. So here's what Sam Wells says. A hero is somebody who is admired for their courage, outstanding achievements, noble qualities. And here's the key. They're often acting in a way that is larger than life and usually standing apart from others due to their exceptional qualities, right? So a hero is somebody who does something to be above and beyond the community. So this is Clint Eastwood. The movie is Sudden Impact. And what is he about to say? Make my day. Make my day. So I'm giving you that as the idea of hero because I don't want you to think about the guy that got on the plane before you at Hartsville because he's serving in the military. That's not what the Bible is talking about when they talk about hero. It is a pejorative term, not a glorified term. So that's Clint Eastwood, standing apart from others due to exceptional qualities. What's a saint? Recognize this guy? Clint Eastwood. Movie, Gran Torino. Is he a hero in that movie? No, he's a saint. Why? A saint, Wells says, is somebody who's a unique and compelling witness to the grace of God through their life. They are not through their own efforts trying to become God-like. They are by the opening of themselves and the growing in their capacity to experience God, witnessing to the presence of God. It's not flawless. A saint's not perfect, but it's deeply committed to embodying the Christian virtues, reflecting Christ's love and humility. Right? Deeply committed to reflecting Christ's love and humility. The saint does not stand apart, but is deeply embedded in the community and committed to becoming part of God's work within that community. That's a saint in Wells' description. What happens in Gran Torino? Do you guys remember? If you hadn't seen this movie, you need to see this movie. You will thank me. It's a brilliant movie. Eastwood is a retired blue-collar worker in Detroit, maybe, or something like that. He's worked in the automobile industry. He's got these 1950s puritanical values, and a Hmong family moves in next door. And he just can't tolerate them, and he doesn't like any of the stuff, and then one of their kids gets picked on by a gang. And he tries to turn this kid into a man the way white middle-class society understood manhood. And it's hilarious. It's hilarious to watch this Hmong kid go in and start mouthing Eastwood's words. And, you know, it's Gran Torino, you want to see it. He drives a Gran Torino. I guess that means he worked for Ford, maybe. Anyway, he ends the movie, and this is a spoiler, but I need to make my point. He knows he's dying. Eastwood does. And so he goes to the gang that is persecuting, victimizing this young Hmong child, who he's grown to love and respect, I might say. He's grown to respect that family and their values because his family is a wreck. They can't even get together for Mother's Day. And the Hmong family, it's Mother's Day every day. And he grows through his time with them to appreciate that. And so he really wants to save this child. And so he goes, and this is the moment where he goes to the place where the gang's hiding out, and he tells them that he's going to kill him. He puts them on notice that he's going to kill him, i.e., make my day. And then he comes back later, pretends he's going to pull a weapon, which he doesn't have. And of course, they open up on him from every window of the house. And in doing so, he's already told the police that something's going on, so they're already en route. So as soon as the shooting is done and Eastwood is lying there, cruciform, in case you missed the imagery, right? The cops come up, there they are with their guns that are still warm, casings everywhere, they all go to jail. Haman child is saved. Is that heroic? Not in the way we're using hero. That's saintly. That is somebody witnessing to the presence of God deeply embedded in their community. So when you think of the line of Cain, you can think of sudden impact and make my day. That's Dirty Harry. But when you think of the line of Seth, think about Gran Torino and a saint. That's the difference, I think, that Cass is trying to point out in these Genesis narratives. So God, of course, gets frustrated. Then he decides he's going to start all over again. But then he runs into Noah, who seems righteous and simple. And he decides he isn't going to start all over again. He's going to save Noah, which is a way of saving the virtues. So think of sourdough bread here. I'm not going to start all over again. I've got something I'm starting with, right, which I've already kind of tested. It's good, and I'll make another loaf from that. Okay? Does that make sense? All right? And that's why he starts with Noah. Now, I want to go back to this fundamental theme because Koss is a Jewish academic and he's talking about Jewish scriptures, but I have cited, and I want you to leave with the idea that the fundamental message here is the movement towards being self-sufficient and defeating death through your own efforts, becoming godlike on your own merit and achievements is heroic and will fail and make a mess of everything. Opening yourself to the presence of God, receiving, expanding your capacity to hold and witness, leads you into loving relationships with others, embeds you in a community, and leads to new life. Does that make sense? Because that's all I'm saying today. The idea that you can do it on your own messes everything up because you wind up trying to dominate everybody else as you steal their being. But the idea that God is giving being away, and when we love other people, we generate new being for both of us, is the saintly mode, which brings new life and a world we can live in and a peace that is real. Now, I didn't think of this. The Apostle Paul thought of this. So it's in Romans. It's in Galatians 5 when he talks about what it means to live a faithful life. And it's also in Galatians 2:20, which I've cited here. I, Paul, the author, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loves me and gave himself for me, i.e. for my sake. What is he saying? He is saying, just as we do when we baptize, that growing in the life of Christ is opening ourselves to the presence of God, expanding our capacity to hold, experience, and witness to that presence as a way of letting love be the formative aspect of the community. That's what Paul is saying. I have been crucified with Christ. I no longer live. When he says I've been crucified with Christ, what he really means is I've given myself to God completely. Right? Completely. That called Christ to the cross, hopefully will have a different ending. But the real sacredness of Christ being on the cross is Christ is giving himself completely to the presence of God, which I also think you can see in the epistle in church this morning. I won't read it now because I've run out of time, but repeatedly throughout that, Jesus is saying, I did everything you told me to do. Every word you gave to me, I gave to them. They know you because they've seen it through me. He's a saint in the way we've used it. Okay. Hero, domination, chaos. Saint, community, peace. Not in the sense of the absence of violence or conflict, but peace in the sense of inclusion, functioning community, respect for individuals, duty to each other. Got it? Okay. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.